Hello, and welcome to the Leading with Andrew show with me, Andrew. I'm so glad you're here. This is a show all about communication and the universal motivation to get better at it. So, whether you are an established speaker, or you are facilitating to top executives, or you just want to get better at articulating what it is that you want, I promise you an energized dose of tips and tools. Every episode, I bring you guests who are extraordinary communicators across several industries. So let's get into it. Today, my guest is Jim Stenman. Jim Stenman is a Dubai-based media professional with extensive industry experience. He has spent more than 7 years at CNN International producing original content for CNN.com, social media, and CNN's flagship news program, Connect the World with Becky Anderson. Most recently, he contributed to the network's coverage of Pope Francis' historic visit to the Arabian Peninsula, ongoing efforts to save the Iran nuclear deal, and joined the US Navy on an exclusive embed in the Persian Gulf. Prior to moving to the UAE, Jim focused on telling the new African story by profiling those making a name for themselves across business, arts, and entertainment. This included personally interviewing South African comedian Trevor Noah in one of his first major features before being named host of The Daily Show. Jim is fluent in Swedish and is from just outside Stockholm. He studied journalism in the US and the UK and earned a degree in journalism from the University of Bedfordshire. Jim, welcome to the Leading with Andrew podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Now, going through what I've just read about that synopsis, you have had an incredible career so far. Was there a defining moment where you thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get into communication and this is what it looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I grew up in a fairly small town in Sweden. I did watch far too much TV growing up, if you were to ask my mother. So naturally, I always had a massive interest in the English language due to my mother's background. So my mom is from Ethiopia, my father's Swedish, and standing out, looking different, growing up in a nation of blondes, essentially, I always felt that if I was able to master the English language, that would allow me to connect with the rest of the world, including Africa. So I think I didn't really think of it along those terms back then, but I definitely wanted to make English a priority because I knew that it would open up the world to me. And then, yeah, I did fall into journalism eventually.
Fall into journalism. I love that. What have been, you must have interviewed some incredible people. What has been one of your favorite interviews up until this point?
I mean, I would say that interview with Trevor Noah was quite memorable.
Okay.
I can't remember how many years ago it was, but this was when he started appearing on U.S. late night TV. So this was probably, I would imagine, a year and a half, maybe 2 years before he got his gig with The Daily Show. And it's interesting, right? I mean, I think that he was clearly a big name in South Africa at the time. And CNN, they still do, have several sponsored shows that focus on Africa. So I thought it was a no-brainer getting him on African Voices, especially as someone that I predicted was going to be quite a big deal in the future. So it was a great interview. I could tell that I felt like initially he probably didn't feel that comfortable with me, but it's interesting. As soon as he realized that I was mixed race as well, his whole demeanor just changed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm going to pick on something you said there, and that is he wasn't quite comfortable in the beginning. What were those signals that you picked up on that made you think that?
I mean, it might just be a case of him being shy back in the day. I'm not sure. But it was definitely an icebreaker. And I could tell how the mood shifted completely once that became clear and he started making fun of me and my accent. So I think that's what you need to do when you're interviewing people. You just need to take the human approach. Don't be too formal. Be a human being. Try to find some common ground with people. And I think sometimes because of how I speak and how I come across, others might make wild assumptions about me, but they don't necessarily ring true.
Okay, well, that's the natural human experience, right? We've got to judge people within 7 seconds so that we can feel comfortable, uncomfortable with them. Talking about the interview process. How do you prepare for an interview with a guest? A high-profile guest like Trevor Noah or Emirates CEO Tim Clark?
I think it's a very different approach depending on the context in which you're interviewing someone. With Trevor Noah, it was a half-hour profile piece on him, so we needed to capture his full story, basically. Beginning, a middle, and an end. So you do want to make sure that you cover as much ground as possible. The interview itself might be an hour and a half, and then what you get on TV is perhaps 22 minutes.
Oh wow!
So that's it's a different approach if it's a feature on the individual, but you have to think backwards, right? How long is the piece that I'm producing? If you know that you're producing a half-hour show, then you're going to need a lot more material. I think with Tim Clark, who's the CEO of Emirates, I can't remember the story that we were covering, but I think it was probably something that was quite newsy. It wasn't a feature on him. It was him reacting to something that was happening in the aviation industry. And so I was producing that interview for CNN's emerging markets editor at the time, John Defterius, who used to be based here in the UAE. And I think the interview itself probably wasn't more than 7 minutes.
Okay.
So pretty quick interview, and then you connect everything using a voiceover. I think when you're doing these high-profile interviews, obviously you're checking for news lines. You're checking for anything that's going to get a lot of attention. So I came from more of a digital background when I came over to the UAE, so I just had to get used to working on TV, which I mean, with TV, it's a different beast. So yeah, it just depends on what you're producing. But I think across board, just try to connect with people on a human level.
I love that.
That's what's gonna get you those sound bites. And I think if you take that approach in everything that you do, even if you're covering business, you'd be surprised with the answers and the output.
Oh wow, that's really interesting. And I think a lot of people don't know that, particularly for people that are starting a YouTube channel or starting a podcast. And we were talking about it before we actually started recording, is how long is the podcast going to be? And when you were saying a 30-minute feature is sometimes an hour and a half of recording, but you said something that's really cool there, which I've never heard before. And that is the way that you do the feature, or the way that you record, is you listening for those news bites. I think you said those news pieces that's going to gain that attention. So you're almost preparing for something like that, working backwards. Exactly. What you're saying. Yeah, you're thinking about what you want from the end product, and that's how you interview.
Exactly.
And a lot of people generally just run into something where they're like, okay, I'm just going to go and record, and there's no planning that goes into that. You mentioned a little bit about being a producer, and we were speaking about it earlier before we started recording, that you started on the producing side, and I read it in your synopsis as well. You started on the producing side before you got in front of the camera. What does a producer do? Talk us through a little bit about what a producer does.
Obviously, it depends on what sector of the media industry that you work in. If you're working in news, you are essentially supporting the reporter or the news presenter. So you do research, you write questions, you might even write the script, which is something that I found really surprising when I first entered the industry. I remember doing an internship with CNN many years before I joined the company. And I found that a little bit disappointing when I realized that, a report by a very world-renowned anchor, the script had been written by someone else. This is quite a common practice, but obviously, as a reporter, you still have to stand for the research and so on. But yeah, you support the reporter, you support the anchor, you make their life easier. You sit down with the editor throughout the editing period. So it gives you a really strong foundation that you can build on, and you're crucial actually when it comes to delivering the final product. And I think part of the reason why you need a producer, especially if you're a high-profile journalist, broadcast journalist, is it's a lot of work. And things need to be checked, and you might be covering several stories at the same time. So that's where it's handy to have producers. And obviously, if you work for a major network, you will have one, if not several producers working for you.
I mean, you've got several stories, and I think that's for a producer, for an anchor, to stay on top of all of that must be challenging.
It is challenging. I think there's more pressure on the reporter and the anchor, especially if they're fronting live programming, because things go wrong. There's going to be technical glitches. There will be issues. You have to be across the latest news lines and things like that, because ultimately, if something goes wrong, they're the ones that are going to suffer. Sometimes producers do a lot of work, but they don't necessarily get the credit for it. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in that sense.
It's like songwriters in the music industry. You know, the singer gets all the praise, or the artist gets all the praise, and the songwriter, I think only really recently do people get recognized as songwriters outside of award ceremonies. But that's so interesting.
I think what's interesting about that is I respect singer-songwriters more.
Okay.
And it's the same thing with journalism, right? If you're working as a reporter or a news anchor, if you come from a producing background, I think it makes you a better journalist because you understand the whole process. Whether you do it yourself or not on a daily basis is a different question. But I think once you understand the whole process, research, questions, maybe even filming and doing some of the editing yourself, it just it makes you respect the people that you work with and that work for you. And you're just more versatile.
I think you also, and human nature as well, you also value the end product a lot more because you've put the effort into editing. And editing is not easy. Post-production is not easy at all because there's so much that you've got to keep in mind. And are you getting the right message across? Because the message, depending on where you cut and where you edit, can completely change, starting from what the intention was to what the output was. That's really interesting. Then you made the transition from producer to in front of the camera. And how's that been going?
I think it's challenging. It's an adjustment. You become a lot more self-aware, as I mentioned to you before. I think for me it was a little bit tricky initially once I started seeing myself on camera. I had done stuff for CNN in the past on camera. I've done other sort of broadcast on camera work, but it's not. It's like it's a muscle that you have to train on a daily or a weekly basis. So no, it's been fine. It's been an adjustment. I've been doing it for a couple of years now. Yep. So I just think you need to be very kind to yourself because it's so easy to be overly critical and analyze every single thing that might be slightly off, but you're not helping yourself. You're not helping the process. And I think a lot of when it comes to going on camera, it's not about perfection. It's not about having a perfect voice. It's not about looking perfect. In fact, I think sometimes those things can be distracting. I think it's more about the energy that you give off to the person interviewing you or the camera, because that's ultimately what people connect with. And it doesn't matter what background you're from. Sure, if you're flicking through the channels and you see someone attractive, you might be more likely to kind of stay on that channel.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately content is king, but delivery is really important as well.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, you mentioned something there that it's incredibly beautiful in a way that you've got to show yourself some self-compassion. I remember when I first saw myself on camera, I did an audition for a lifestyle television program in South Africa called Top Billing. And I completely messed it up. I had 3 tries and I had to walk across the room and I had to say a particular thing about Singapore and fashion in Singapore. It was like a lifestyle coverage of fashion in Singapore. And that, I messed it up completely. But now when I think back, I can do that script. Like if you throw a bucket of cold water on me at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, do the Top Billing audition, I would probably be able to do it without a doubt. But I wasn't able to watch myself on camera for quite a while because I immediately went into what you were mentioning. You're looking at everything that you're doing wrong. And I think that stops a lot of people getting in front of a camera or, hitting record on their mobile phones.
But I'm also assuming that you just memorized the lines, or did you create those lines yourself?
Oh, no, I memorized. We had to memorize. Yeah. But because of nerves, I completely... And I didn't know what I looked like on camera. So this was something that we were talking about with Monique as well, where when I see in public speakers or people that are podcasting or doing a YouTube show, they tend to worry if you're not experienced or you don't know what you look like when you are presenting or speaking. You tend to focus on what you look like. So you get really awkward.
Absolutely.
And you don't know where to look. And what you were talking about with connection with guests, you lose that because you're so focused on what you look like. So I say to people all the time, I do camera work with a lot of people because that's what you look and that's what you sound like. And I think the journey to loving yourself, completely different topic and different podcast, but the whole journey to loving yourself starts with accepting what you look and sound like. And that's when you're able to focus on the message, particularly in a formal speaking gig or formal speaking anywhere, is when you know what you look like, you focus on the message, which means you are focusing on your audience. Do you have, just out of curiosity, do you have any rituals that you do before you get on camera?
I mean, it depends on what I'm going to be filming, but I tend to go to the barbershop beforehand to just sort out my grooming, because ultimately that's something that makes me more confident on camera. Knowing the topic obviously helps as well. But I think beyond those things, I try not to overthink it. Because, and this is something that I've started doing recently, so I'm moderating panel discussions, whether it's in the UAE or Africa. I think if I spend too much time focusing on what I look like, it's going to distract from the big picture. And I need to know my shit. Yeah. That's ultimately what it comes down to. So if you can, I mean, maybe, I don't know, do whatever it takes for you to feel more confident and comfortable on camera, at least with me knowing that, you know, I got a fresh haircut, groomed my facial hair. It allows me to focus on other things that are much more important, because ultimately you need to know what you're talking about. And you mentioned memorizing a script. Good for you. I think a lot of people do that, especially if you're on camera talent or a TV presenter. I think when you're doing journalism, it's a little bit different because it's your work at the end of the day. It's your script. It's your lines. You have to stand for everything that you say. So that is something that I really embrace, and I would struggle to deliver on someone else's script because I have to put my own spin on it. And I think part of what I do, and this has always been the case with me, I don't want to say that I dumb things down, but I just try to focus on the human angle. Because again, that's how you connect with people. But not just that. Even if you're interviewing a CEO, I mean, I spoke to one of the most senior executives at Safaricom, and they've expanded into Ethiopia. Took the same approach. Obviously, I'm not an expert when it comes to the telco industry, but I know the big picture. I know what it means in terms of their expansion into Ethiopia, because they've had a state monopoly on those things. But ultimately, what you want to get to is, how's this going to impact people? They're going to have more choice. And what does that mean for the economy? What does it mean for businesses? He was South African, so you're coming in as an outsider. What are your impressions of Ethiopia? Is it even comparable to South Africa or other parts of Africa? And I think by asking those questions, even if you end up excluding the answers from the final piece, you're going to be able to make that human connection. And if you're able to make the human connection in the first 5 minutes, or maybe even first 2 minutes, I think you're off to a really good start.
Do you have any go-to questions in the bank to build that rapport with a guest from the get-go?
I don't. I mean, I'd like to think that I have pretty good general knowledge of the world. I don't know everything that's happening, but I feel like I know enough to talk to anyone about maybe things that are happening in their region. So that allows you to connect with people, not just in a journalism context. Even if I run into someone at a pub in Dubai or anywhere, I think that's a skill, and it's definitely something that's I don't want to say changed my life, but it's given me access to the rest of the world, because I'm kind of obsessed with trying to understand other countries and other people through a non-Western lens. Does that make sense?
It does.
Because
It's big though, so we need to unpack
Yeah,
that. So you're trying to understand people and countries in a non-Western way.
yes.
Okay, say more.
No, I think, I mean, obviously, born and raised in Europe. My mom's from Africa, so my background is a little bit different. And I think journalism, especially when you're talking about established big platforms, most people that are, heading up these companies, they're all white guys. Maybe some women now as well. Things are shifting a little bit. But if you look at sort of senior management, and that informs how you cover the world. I mean, you might make the argument, oh, no, I've lived in Singapore, I've lived in Africa, but your perspective is going to be a little bit different. So I'm just very interested in understanding people through their experience, and I try to leave my perceptions sort of at the door. They still stay with me. I think we have. You're always going to be shaped by your upbringing and what you've experienced growing up. But I think if you're willing to maybe push it aside a little bit as you're getting to know people, it just opens up a completely different type of conversation that you could grow from as well. What was your original question? Because I feel like I've gone off topic a little bit. There was one point I wanted to make here.
So it was unpacking the whole, you're trying to understand people and countries in a non-Western way. And we started off previously with how we structure questions. I asked you, do you have any questions in the bank to establish that rapport?
Exactly. So the one question I always try to include in conversations, interviews is, what's your biggest dream and hope for the future? And it sounds really cliche, but again, it's going to allow you to really get to know that person.
Absolutely. I think that gives the person an opportunity it gives you a little bit more than the story, because it gives you the story of the person.
Exactly.
And the way that you ask the questions would probably frame differently with this data that's being presented to you. Wow, that's who's left the biggest impression on you throughout your career?
Wow, good question. I think I've changed a little bit. I'm much more of a cynic these days.
And that's okay.
Who has left the biggest impression? I would say, without mentioning names perhaps, but when you meet celebrities that are, especially, actors, musicians, that are the same person off camera.
Okay.
Those individuals leave the biggest impression because it's real. And I think with the majority of people, it's not real. And it's a little bit, obviously, growing up in the 90s, I had a deep appreciation of pop culture, but I like real people. So if you're not real even as a celebrity, I'm not going to connect with you. And also, if you have a completely different personality off camera, what does that say about? Obviously, you're only showing one part of your personality, but I think it's a little bit disappointing because we spend so much time looking up to celebrities and celebrating celebrity culture, and I'm very, very much against that these days because I think we need role models that are doing real in the real world. And if you have a lot of money, sure, you can launch a makeup line or your own fashion line and turn it into success because you're promoting it yourself.
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying that that doesn't make you a skilled business person if you have, if you've taken the Kim Kardashian approach or whatever. It's smart what they're doing, but I think we have to contextualize it a little bit. And there's so many people that are doing real things in the real world and solving challenges, and it's not necessarily ego-driven in the same way, and maybe they're not desperate to be seen. And I'm quite interested in giving people like that a platform. It may not get as many views on YouTube or wherever it gets published, but those stories are more interesting.
The devil works hard, but Kris Jenner does work harder in terms of the Kardashians. Who has been a role model for you as you've grown throughout your career in how you cover news stories, how you anchor yourself in something that you firmly believe in. Has there ever been anybody that you look up to and goes or think, wow, this person really stands by what they say or what they're reporting on? I feel like I could align with that.
I'd say no.
Okay. All right. Amazing. It opens it for discussion.
Yeah, and it's not to be critical of other people, but again, how do I best articulate this? I don't really celebrate people in that way anymore. I think I have more of a holistic view of who people are, and you have the on camera, on air persona, and then there's a different person a lot of the time off camera. I mean, sure, there's people you've come across in the industry that are really good journalists that do amazing work. But for me personally, to connect with someone, it's not enough for you to be a good journalist. I think you have to be a good human as well. So if you're able to combine those two, then maybe that becomes more of a platform, more of a blueprint for how I'd like to see my own career develop, or just someone that I look up to. So I think being successful at your job is not necessarily enough, because once you find that success, especially if you're a name, if you're known around the world or maybe just in your country, at some point it's going to become very ego-driven, whether we're willing to admit to it or not. It's just kind of a natural extension, I think, of being known, of being on camera. But it's really dangerous, because if it goes unchecked, then sure, you might still be doing important work in Africa or covering conflicts in the Middle East, but you, how do I say this? You don't necessarily back up those actions in terms of your character. And I think because of my humble background, I think because of the fact that my mom was a refugee, I connect with everyday people. I connect with people who've seen struggle, because if you haven't seen struggle, or if you're not willing to talk about challenging things that have happened in your life, then why should I celebrate you? Why should I look up to you? I mean, I think we've all worked hard in our own ways, but there's real value in overcoming struggle and sharing some of your most difficult moments, especially if you have a platform, because people look up to you.
They do. I think, we've been connected for a while, for a couple of years now. And I watch your stories and what you post on Instagram and when you're covering certain news stories. And in the way that you communicate, which is one of the reasons why I asked you on here, is phenomenal. You've got such a presence on camera. And when you're speaking, you've got that authority of listen to what I'm saying because it is of value. Mm-hmm. And at some point in your career, you probably will have people that are looking up to you, that are starting their journey in journalism and news. What would you say to somebody if they had to come up to you and go, hey, Jim, I'm starting in this industry. What would be some of your advice for me?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a different era these days, and I've expanded beyond journalism. Mm-hmm. I've done media consulting and things like that, which has been great. I think you need to find something that makes you unique, because it's incredibly competitive, and you might be more talented than the person next door or the person that's interviewing for the same role, but maybe he or she has better contacts or better knows someone within the company that's going to allow them to maybe enter in a junior position and then work their way up. I think we have to embrace who we are, and we have to embrace what makes us unique. And when I started out in the media industry in the UK, this would have been the early, I think probably from 2009 and onwards, I believe. Most people were white, middle class, British, couple of posh people, individuals as well, maybe in senior roles. And because my experience is different, I grew up in Scandinavia, and my dad's Swedish. I had a very middle class background, and my parents weren't necessarily super accomplished, but because I came from a country that still has pretty high taxes, regardless of how much money your parents make, you're still able to have a decent life, and you're still able to go to university. It's not a class-based society. So going back to when I entered journalism, I felt that maybe I didn't belong, and it was difficult to fully embrace the uniqueness of my experience. So I think you have to find an environment that welcomes that. And I mean, obviously, this was more than a decade ago, so it's a different. I think it's a different beast these days.
Okay.
But at the same time, a lot of these companies are obsessed about diversity and inclusion, which is, I mean, it's a good thing.
It's a good thing and sometimes a feel-good hack.
Well, exactly. So I think a lot of it is just window dressing, actually, which is something that I speak about with my friends all the time. You might be passionate about that when it comes to social media, but if it's not reflected at an executive level, people in decision-making roles within your company, especially in the West, then it's going to be pretty difficult to make the argument that you are pro diversity and inclusion. So I would have embraced that much more earlier in my career, but it's difficult because if you talk about race, if you talk about communities that aren't necessarily, that don't have the same representation, then you risk alienating white people. And if you're alienating the majority, that could be really dangerous for your career. At least that's how I felt back then. So I think it's a really difficult kind of road to navigate, and maybe people are more receptive to having that conversation now. But even if you're having the conversation, I think you need to not approach it from a perspective of woke culture, but just stick to the facts and make the case that ultimately these companies, whether it's media platforms or other firms, that they're going to benefit from the representation, especially if you're covering the world, for example. So again, it just goes back to what I was saying before, that I think it's incredibly important that we look. How do I say this? It's really important for me that we don't view the rest of the world through a Western prism, because dynamics are really shifting at the moment. I think power is kind of moving away from the West towards the East and China. And it's very easy just to kind of point fingers and say, we're not going to engage with Africa, or we're not going to engage with this part of Asia because you don't believe in human rights. It's a compelling argument to make, but at the same time, we can't stop talking to people, because once you stop talking to people, it becomes really dangerous. So whether we're talking about politics or just a willingness to connect with someone in a different country that has a different perspective, if you're open to that, if you're open to having the conversation without perhaps getting angry, then I think it's going to make you a richer person.
I love that, having the conversation without getting angry. And it's really easy to talk about something like that in an environment like this, where it's theoretical. Yeah, absolutely.
That's
Teamwork.
my beef with woke culture.
Okay, great. And when it actually comes down to it, you've said woke culture, and I'm about to use a woke term, triggered. I get triggered really easy if I'm passionate about something. I won't say that I get triggered, but I can go from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds, which I'm able to, in a professional environment, I'm able to really hone that in and bring it in, because time and place, right? But
In a personal capacity, it's a different story.
in a personal capacity, a very, very different story. And I want to unpack that a little bit more as well. Has there ever been a time where you have, in your consultancy, in your company, in your producer time, in front of the camera, where you've been asking people questions and the answers that you're getting, you kind of feel your body temperature raising up and you're going,
But why? Because they're not giving you the answers
not
you
necessarily
want?
the answers that you want, but they are taking an entirely different view that could have been either unexpected or completely opposite to what you believe.
No, it's fine. I welcome that. It makes it more interesting.
How?
And obviously, if you're not answering a question, especially if we're talking about a news piece, if you're not answering the question and running off in a completely different direction, you're not going to look good on camera.
Okay, there's so much I want to ask even more now.
Yeah.
For the purpose of the podcast is to get better at communication. So I want to pick on that a little bit more. And one of the things I want to ask, particularly with somebody who asks a lot of questions and has their own style in the way that they do it, what makes a good guest?
A good guest is someone who's willing to speak and who will welcome those questions. And I think there's a lot of people that give interviews, but they're not really willing to go there with you. And if you're not willing to do that, stay home. There's no point. And you're not going to come across well if you're avoiding questions. I think a lot of people have a fear of being interviewed. I mean, that's why media training is much needed, especially I think in the developing world, including here, because it's a different type of society. You don't necessarily want to get things wrong, but there's ways to navigate that. And I think that there's always massive value in talking and getting your story out. I think it's just a question of how do I do that? What kind of language should I use to connect with people?
Is it your Slay era? Are you on brand?
Exactly. But again, just go back to the human approach.
Absolutely. I think we say it all the time. And I think you're a millennial, right?
Born 1983, I think so.
Yes, you are.
Slightly older than you.
With millennials, I think we've also been the social constructs around us of how we should be a certain way at certain times. Where we are right now with people going, yeah, be yourself, be authentic, connect with people. And Brene Brown preaches it all the time. And I love Brene Brown about being authentic and finding that connection. Do you ever find conflict, or what would be the advice you would give to somebody that is in conflict with how they should be in a presentation mode, whether they're talking to camera as opposed to who they are?
I think it's a difficult question to answer. Main thing is, don't pretend to be somebody else. Maybe there's a more formal version of Andrew, and you're happy and comfortable to bring him out. But it might be a case of being more formal in terms of your attire, how you dress, but you still speak as Andrew. As soon as you take on a persona and you change your voice, or holding back in terms of hand gestures and those things, I think it becomes, you probably feel a little bit like an imposter. I'm not good at those things. I try to be myself. It works within the context of what I'm doing, whether it's journalism or consulting. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I think what I'm hearing is you embraced yourself really early at a really, really early age. And I think that's helped you shape the way that you navigate through the world. And sometimes I find people trying to be so many different things. I am so guilty of that. When I first made a YouTube video years ago, I was trying to be that lifestyle TV presenter that I auditioned to be and never got. And somebody actually messaged me on Instagram the other day going, hey, really loving the content that you're putting out. It's so different to what it was, and it's so much easier to connect to. And have I leaned completely into my style? I think I'm still figuring that out as your confidence grows.
Yeah.
But again, that shouldn't stop you from getting in front of the camera, because the camera definitely polarizes your actions, your gestures, your tone of voice, and how you come across, whether you're monotone or whether you've got melody. But yeah, I think you leaned into yourself at a really young age because you knew that you had something to give to the world.
I think so, and it's still a journey. I'm not perfect. I think since leaving,
No, you're not perfect. Oh my god.
no, but since leaving CNN, I've grown a lot. I started my own company where I'm doing consulting and creating documentaries, and I've done some corporate storytelling. So it kind of exposed me to the sort of business aspect of things, which I think sometimes when you're in journalism, you're so focused on the story that you forget about the revenue. You forget about building relationships beyond sources. So all of those things really matter, because if you don't have a good network, you're not going to be able to deliver anything.
Absolutely.
But I think in terms of knowing who I am, yes, sometimes you get a little bit sidetracked, but in the last couple of years, I've gone back to sort of my dreams and aspirations of maybe my late teenage years, early 20s, and I tweet a lot about Africa. I post stories about the continent, whether it's me traveling, and that's just part of my experience. That's just part of who I am. It's not going to resonate with everyone. A lot of people that follow me probably are not that interested in Africa, but I think the more you show of yourself, the easier it's going to be to connect with the right people. And
Totally.
and that's what it comes down to ultimately for me. So it's not easy. It's still a journey. I'm learning new things all the time, but I guess I've reached a stage where I'm not going to apologize for who I am anymore. Either we connect or we don't connect. And I think I'm naturally attracted to people that feel comfortable in their own shoes. A lot of people don't. And it creates conflict because I'm willing to speak my mind. And maybe in the past, I didn't necessarily feel like there was always an opportunity to do so, because speaking your mind, especially when you're an employee, that's a very dangerous thing. I'm not saying that you're going to get fired on the spot, but I think a lot of corporates don't necessarily encourage that, which connects to, I think, this trend of bringing your authentic self to work. Yeah, that's a great thing, but it doesn't necessarily
As long as your authentic self looks like this.
Exactly. Exactly. But I think through working for myself, through doing freelance work, it's allowed me to kind of remove myself from that corporate persona. And that's where I've seen a lot of growth in the past few years. It's actually, it's quite shocking. I feel like a different person.
Oh, really?
And I like this version of myself much more. So if I ever go into a full-time job again, that's going to be, I think it's going to be a challenge. And I would probably have to be very upfront about it with the person that would potentially look to hire me, because I don't want to conform anymore. This is who I am. I know who I am. And if I'm not able to embrace that, maybe you can't like fully be yourself in every single situation.
But there are so many different versions. I love the conversations like this. There are so many different versions of yourself, right?
Yeah.
And the one version of yourself is going to, when you're presenting, when you're on stage, when you're in front of a camera. I know that when I'm presenting to senior executives and the person that's sitting at the table now, it's still me at a foundational level, but it's a different version because it's appropriate to the environment. And I think
Absolutely.
Bring your authentic self to work. It's great. And you said something that I wanted to elaborate on, and that was, you know who you are, but I also think you know the value add. You know what you add can bring in value.
I do. I think it can be a tough sell for some people, or maybe companies, or whoever you're engaging with. And if it's a tough sell, then that's not a relationship for you.
You attract the people that are meant for you if you're authentic.
You do, and I think maybe some I mean, I've certainly, so during my entrepreneurial journey, these past couple of years, I mean, I've definitely engaged with people and individuals where I felt like, okay, we're aligned. We have similar values in theory, but then when you're kind of exposed to them in a business context, that's when you perhaps lose respect for some people. And listen, I think running a business is very different from sort of the private or the personal individual. But if you're claiming to be, how do I say this? Not a dynamic leader, but a thoughtful leader, and you care about your employees and all those things that are trending these days, then it needs to be backed up with your actions as well. And I think there's a lot of people, they're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. Is that
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that just makes me roll my eyes. Listen, I'm not perfect. It's easy for me to sit here and diss people, but I think I kind of have that journalist mindset that back it up with actions. If you're not backing it up with actions, then unfortunately, I mean, over time, you kind of see right through people, but you might lose respect as well. And I think that there's I've noticed this with people in my own network. There's a huge disconnect between how they see themselves and how others see them, especially, in this era where you can become a star on LinkedIn. You could be a thought leader, or you have a massive following on Instagram, and maybe you do have your own business. Maybe that's how you make your money. But that online persona is very different from the reality.
Oh, it's like a mic drop moment. I love that. The biggest piece of advice that I'm taking away from this, you've given such amazing tidbits here and there. And I think one of the biggest things is just being yourself on camera, building that rapport with people really quickly if you're interviewing them, by focusing on that human connection and leaning into who you are and just really owning it. As long as it's not hurting anybody, as long as you're not disrespecting people and you're able to have a conversation. I think it was something that we were touching on a little earlier, where we were going, you enjoy debating, and debating is really healthy because generally a debate goes around, you have a debate with somebody who's got a different perspective to you. And it's actually something we were mentioning on the previous episode as well, is I try and surround myself with people that, particularly in a professional environment and in this Leading with Andrew environment, that do not think like me, because that's how you learn. That's how you grow. And I think I might go as far as to say that's where you learn to love those parts about yourself, because when you're with people that maybe think a little differently to you, they might bring out those parts and they might be useful, as opposed to being in a group of people that are like you, where the parts that you may not like about you aren't valued in that circle. It's really big.
No, absolutely. And I think that's why you need to have debates. If you can't have that within your circle, if you share the exact same values, the exact same ideas, I mean, listen, we're not getting any younger. You're making to maintain relationships in your 30s, especially I think after the age of 35 and upwards, it's challenging. You have to find time. People are busy. So you are going to make time for people that add value. And ultimately, if we're not growing, what are we here for?
That is so true. That is so true. Has there ever been a time where you were going or experiencing something really challenging in your career and you thought, oh, should I pivot or do I stick this out?
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to share?
So you're asking me whether I thought about giving up.
Not necessarily giving up, pivoting. Pivoting is not giving up.
Okay.
If you
pivot elsewhere,
where you thought, okay, no, I'll stick it out. And how did you navigate through that challenge?
I think you have to listen to your intuition. When I left the full-time role, I I did some commercial work. I've done short form documentaries that are more kind of, I'd like to say marketing driven, but that's not the word for it. I think that I have more of a storytelling mindset from that of a journalist. Find a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then if you can't sell it to an international audience, if you can't explain why this stuff matters, then there's no story. It was really frustrating for me to deal with people in PR and marketing. I had 1 or 2 clients in PR and marketing, and at the end of the day, the money might have been good, but when I looked at the end result and when I looked at the process, I think I reached a conclusion that, ultimately, yes, I think I could do really good work in this space, but it's not for me because the content doesn't appeal to me. And I think that's something these companies don't really understand. I mean, I do get that if they're hiring you, that obviously they're going to want to push their agenda, but it's a different time these days. We're in a different era. If you're trying to push out content on LinkedIn or social media, it has to resonate with people and it can't be too salesy. Absolutely. So I've reached a point where I can't fake passion anymore, and I'm not taking on projects that I'm not passionate about. It's tough. I wish I could do that, but I just don't have the energy. So the challenging part of it, or the sad part, if you will, is you're potentially missing out on revenue. I think the good part is you're just embracing topics and projects that you're going to pour a lot of love into, and the output is going to be so much better because of that. And I think that's also, I mean, that's one of the things about getting older. Like, you have limited energy. You can't run in all these directions anymore. It gives you have to be focused in order to have an impact.
What do you mean, Jim? I mean, we're going for a run after this podcast.
You may be. I'm not doing it.
I think even though doing those things that you weren't necessarily passionate about, I think it made you more passionate about only doing things you're passionate about. So I don't think it should stop anybody from exploring any.
It's healthy.
Absolutely.
It's very healthy.
I wouldn't have gotten to this podcast had I not made videos that I might not agree with anymore, those many, many years ago. But this got me to where we are today. So I think the biggest takeaway for today would be, whatever work you're doing, whether it comes to, particularly in your profession or how I coach people when it comes to presenting and speaking, is just really double down on being yourself and finding that human connection, because that's what comes across on camera, and always be prepared.
And allow yourself to fail as long as you learn from fail. I mean, it's another cliche, but I think a lot of people don't allow themselves, and they're too critical of themselves. I mean, I have friends in my circle, someone I met just the other day, actually, who's overanalyzing every single step she takes, and then overanalyzing what others...
Critical analysis. What? No, paralysis.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we'd be very surprised if we knew how little times others spend thinking about all of our actions.
Yeah.
So just learn from every experience, even if it's been incredibly tough. Try to put a spin on it, and try to grow as a human being. Because ultimately, if we're not growing on a human level, what are we here for?
100%. Thank you so much. I've got rapid fire for you, though. So you ready for rapid fire? Okay. What is the one thing you learned through experience that, had you learned sooner, would have changed your course?
I think the value of managing relationships. I underestimated that.
I love that. 3 songs on your playlist, and why do you love them?
Okay, so I can't give you specific tracks, but I'm spending a lot of time listening to Nigerian pop music, Ethiopian jazz at the moment, and actually discovering really great dance music out of South Africa, of all places.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll get some of those songs from you later.
So the algorithm of Spotify has just changed my life.
Algorithms are the best. I enjoy my TikTok algorithm. What do people get wrong about you all or most of the time?
I think because I have a certain tone to my voice, I think I have natural authority in my voice. And some people think that I might be very dismissive or matter of fact, but I'm actually open to other perspectives. I'm open to the debate. And I welcome it.
Number one travel hack.
Number one travel hack. Travel light, if you can. I think that's it. And I mean, obviously bring all your tech gear, whatever it takes, just to feel at home anywhere in the world. I mean, it's amazing how much the world has changed. And just having your laptop or your phone. I mean, I film some stuff even on my phone.
Brilliant.
In my work.
So no excuse. Get on your phone to film yourself.
No, but like in your work, whether you're doing an Instagram live or even doing short documentaries, I mean, it's incredible what we can achieve these days.
That's amazing.
So travel light and just be ready to get on the road.
If you're always ready, you never have to get ready. You're on a private jet and you can have 3 people with you, famous or not famous. Who are they and what are you talking about? Just the topic.
3 people? Am I interviewing people on a jet?
No, you've just got 3 people with you. If you want to interview them, because that's your go-to, by all means.
3 people on a jet. Interesting. That's tough. I mean, I'd bring my mom with me because she lives in Sweden, so I don't really get to see her that often anymore. And it's really interesting to see her in different environments and how she reacts to it. So she would be one of those people for sure. In terms of the other individuals, I don't know. It's a difficult one. Where are we traveling to? Where are we going?
No, don't.
Are we just isolated?
Rapid fire.
Okay, moving on.
Moving on. Finish the sentence. Getting better at communication is
key to being successful in life.
I love that. Jim, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. Where can listeners connect with you or go and follow?
I think the best place to connect with me is probably on Instagram, so at Jim Stenman. I'm relaunching my website at the moment.
Okay, great. We'll look out for that.
And we're on LinkedIn as well.
Great. Jim, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Well, there you go. Another episode on communication. Thank you so much for joining us today. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, connect with us on Instagram at Leading with Andrew.